So the new Disney Plus show, She-Hulk, has basically set conservative, I guess, YouTube and anti-SJW nerd channels alight. These people are extremely mad at the mere existence of this show and certain elements of dialogue in the show. And I thought I'd talk about it today, and I thought I'd finally make a video about how capitalism is ruining the MCU, and as a byproduct, the MCU is ruining cinema in many ways. Now, I had this tweet maybe a month ago. I said you can't be a leftist and like the MCU. A lot of people took it very, very seriously. I was, of course, joking. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you know I like to have a little fun. Maybe a bit of trolling, a bit of memeing. It's all in good taste, which a lot of you actually don't have, considering how many of my followers actually got mad that I said that and got mad that I generally don't like the MCU either. But I just want to talk about the problems, because She-Hulk has become quite notorious for having problems with its special effects, and it's become pretty clear in recent months that Marvel is treating its contractors and employees like total garbage, and they're massively overworking them, which results in actually a pretty bad product. Now, I'm going to talk about this film, but I remember seeing Black Panther, and I actually thought in that film, damn, the CGI in this is terrible. Like, how is this such an expensive movie? And then I see more Marvel movies lately, and I'm like, these effects are terrible. How are they releasing this thinking it's okay? But it's because, just like with video games, they are crunching their workers, and the deflection by the creatives behind the She-Hulk series is really bizarre in saying that they basically stand in solidarity with them, but it's like, you're also like the director, writer and star of the show. Could you not do more to alleviate their pretty brutal conditions? So today what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about the backlash to She-Hulk being woke. We're then going to talk about how Marvel treats its workers and talk about this very real capitalist exploitation of special effects workers. And then I just want to talk generally about how Marvel being as dominant as it is not a good thing for your films. It's not a good thing for the industry. And more from like an artistic standpoint, I really cannot stand the MCU. And like I've always said, these movies might be entertaining, and I'll admit that they are entertaining, but beyond that, they aren't really that special. And I think the original films cultivated by the Russo brothers, like Winter Soldier, have created a style that is basically artistically bankrupt. And obviously anti-SJWs don't hate the MCU because of, like, you know, capitalism or because artistically it's bad. They just think, personally, it's always pushing like a leftist agenda when it really isn't. But before we go any further, please like the video. And I guess for today's comments, what is criticism you would level at the MCU, especially from a more like liberal leftist perspective? Rather than crying about like identity politics and wokeness, I'd be interested to hear people's perspectives, even people who actually still really like the MCU. I'd like to hear what your criticisms are. Also, follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, on Instagram. Check out the subreddit in the description. Check out my second channel. Also, consider becoming a patron. I'm building up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of becoming a patron are getting access to the Discord server and getting my Nintendo Switch friend code. Also, when I'm in Vietnam, I'm probably going to post a few exclusive videos on the Patreon itself to talk about like life in Vietnam. I'm moving in about a week, for about 5 or 6 months. I haven't decided yet. But if you care about that and want to support my work, consider becoming a patron. So before we get into the insane backlash of She-Hulk, like this is all over conservative media right now, I guess I should talk about my own like relationship with the MCU. So I was 12 when Iron Man came out, I believe, maybe 11, I'm not sure. And when I saw the first Iron Man, obviously I grew up on like superhero movies, like, you know, Batman Begins, obviously The Dark Knight, I think released in 2008 as well. Watched the old Spider-Mans, always liked them as a kid, you know, kids love superhero movies, I was no different. And when I saw the first Iron Man, I thought, like, this is actually really cool, and it doesn't feel like the other films. And then growing up as a teenager, of course, I watched, like, you know, Iron Man 2, Captain America, watched the Avengers, and generally I was pretty into nerd media for a while. Like, I've always been a big fan of Star Wars, and I still am a big fan of Star Wars, but I really got into more like comic book related media, and I absolutely loved the Arkham games. Arkham City, by far the best, and I would say one of the best video games I've ever played, like solid 10 out of 10. I still think it's the best Batman game as well. And during my first like year and a half at university, I was still pretty into Marvel. I think it was when the Russo brothers became more prominent, I started to dislike it more. So then you had like the Winter Soldier, you had Age of Ultron, you then had Captain America 3, Civil War, then you had Spider-Man Homecoming, and then obviously you had the conclusion to the Avengers of Part 1 and Part 2. But then in my head, all these movies artistically kind of blur together. To me, they all kind of seem like the same film. And I will admit there are certain films in the MCU, maybe like Thor Ragnarok, which do stand out a bit more. Black Panther more for its like art style and stuff. I do think that stands out. But by and large, there's a core in the MCU, especially mainly directed by the Russo brothers. It all just blended into one in my mind, and I was really checked out by the end of the second Avengers film. And then I just thought, like, this is getting very boring. And I remember I came out of Spider-Man Homecoming, and I was with a friend. I literally had nothing to say about the movie. Like, yeah, it was enjoyable and everything, but I had really nothing to talk about. Like, it was a solid movie, it entertained me for 2 hours, and a couple funny moments, and that's about it. And that's when I realised I don't actually care about the MCU anymore. Like, I will go watch these films as part of this like cultural phenomenon up until the end of the second Avengers. I haven't gone to an MCU film since. By and large, I think the movies have really outstayed their welcome, and I think it should have ended with the second Avengers, and maybe they should have done something else. But because, you know, capitalism incentivizes infinite growth, the MCU is never ending. We are going to get the MCU probably until I die. And there will be reboots, there will be multiverses, but there will be a through line going back to 2008's Iron Man. And I think that's the problem, because these movies dominate all the time. And I just feel artistically and creatively, they are pretty bankrupt. And even with the recent, you know, Thor film, it seems like Taika Waititi didn't even really care about it, which we're going to talk about a bit later. So now let's get into the backlash to She-Hulk the series. You guys will know, big Marxist over here. I'm all for leftist messaging in films and TV, but you guys also know I do really like my films and TV shows. I like things to be a bit more subtle, and I don't really want to feel like characters in TV shows and movies, unless it's like, you know, a Scorsese narration thing or like Henry Hill talking to the audience, I don't really want to feel like I'm literally being spoken to by the writers in current year. So in some ways, I understand the backlash to this scene in She-Hulk, but I have a bit more nuance to it. So you guys will have seen this going viral. And they posted it on Kotaku in Action, which is like this Anti-SJW subreddit. So she's talking to Bruce Banner. I do it pretty much every day, because if I don't, I will get called emotional or difficult, or might just literally get murdered. So I'm an expert at controlling my anger because I do it infinitely more than you. She also talks about like being catcalled or being mansplained by people at work who think just because she's a woman, they're talking down to her. Of course, the comments are absolutely seething about this. Simply existing as a woman causes more stress than being hunted across the world by various governments and militaries for a decade or more. It's so messed up that people see scenes like this and wholeheartedly believe they are the truth of the world. This doesn't even include the part where she pretends to be more victimized than Banner because she gets catcalled and mansplained. I won't be shocked if she also lectures Daredevil about being privileged. Such a stupid scene, but I get confused when she said she might literally get murdered, like it came out of nowhere. It's also funny and shows her privilege that she thinks, as an affluent white woman lawyer, she is at higher risk of being murdered. I'm sure impoverished black women would say otherwise. So before I talk about this a bit more and talk about like my own criticisms and my own like maybe more positive things to say about this scene, I just want to show you Ben Shapiro also reacting to this, because just like the incels in there, he also hates this scene.
This has been hailed as just the most heroic thing. Well, Disney put the talking points from Jezebel right in the show. It's amazing. You have accounts like a co-host of Geeks of the Week, quote, She-Hulk might genuinely be the first time some young men hear a woman speak candidly about experiences like this. It might not seem like it, but it's hugely important. Is you lecturing in the most tendentious fashion about how hard women have it in the United States in the middle of a comic book show? Is that hugely important? Or is that you guys virtue signaling to a group of people who entirely agree with you? I love the way that it works in Hollywood. It really is pretty spectacular. What happens is a writer puts something like this in the script, and the producer's like, this isn't very good, but we do have to put it. It's very important. It's so important. And then the director's like, I'm going to clap you on the back, producer and writer, because you did something so important. And then they all have a great big circle hug. Point out here at the very end where she says, you might literally be murdered if you're a woman for no other reason than you're a woman. It's basically like Afghanistan around here. Let me read you a statistic. Okay, here are the total number of murder victims in the United States in 2020. by gender. You ready? Total number of murder victims. Altogether, 17,754. And this is according to the Statista Research Department in 2020. 17,754 total murder victims. Female murder victims, 3,573. Male victims, 1,146. So if we're just talking about like who gets killed in the United States, like in terms of homicide victims, I'm going to note that men get killed way more often than women.
So a lot of people very butthurt about that line about being murdered. Ben Shapiro quoting some statistics there for you to show that, yeah, it's men that get murdered more. Ben Shapiro, why don't you look at the statistics of who murders women the most? Because by and large, women aren't murdering each other. Most women who get murdered by partners, ex-partners, husbands and stuff like that. Ben Shapiro, maybe look up at that because that is kind of what she's talking about. Now, I have complex thoughts on this scene, right? So Spike Lee is a director I like and dislike, and I feel like his films serve a very good purpose. I feel like Spike Lee's films, especially his more recent films, Black Klansman and The Five Bloods, I think they're extremely unsubtle. They feel like they're lecturing the audience, and I feel like they're very, very basic in a lot of their political messaging. But I still think a lot of people should watch these movies for the political messaging, not so much because they're great movies, because I think both those movies, especially The Five Bloods, aren't very good at all. But I think they have value as some sort of education. So that's where I'm coming at it from. So this scene in She-Hulk, I feel like maybe some people do need to hear this. And I think people crying about this most do actually need to hear it a lot. Obviously, you see a lot of women talk like this on Twitter. You guys in your own life have probably heard women talk about this stuff. I have a younger sister who is in her 20s. They've spoke to me about things like this, and often how men don't realize how intimidating and threatening they can be in certain situations and stuff like this, and how patronizing they can be. So this is like a very real thing. And the funny thing is, this annoys them because they disagree with what she's saying, even though it's true, right? This is why it annoys them, because they see it as fake feminist politics. They've made it up. As Ben Shapiro was saying there, they're talking as if the United States is Afghanistan. Someone in those comments was saying she's a privileged white woman. And that's obviously totally ridiculous and shows how pervasive patriarchy is in like brainwashing people to have such a knee-jerk response to this scene, mainly based on what she is saying. I have no problem with what she is saying. I like what she's saying. But in terms of like artistically, and this might be a bit of a redundant point, you guys let me know. Because like I said, with Spike Lee films, I feel people should watch them, even though I feel like they're very preachy. And I feel like they are worse films for being like these big lectures on certain things. I think scenes like this are quite poorly written, and I think kind of defeats some of the purpose of having like a visual medium like TV and film. It does feel like someone is talking through the screen at you about like very relevant political issues. And I think there could be a lot more subtle way to play this out throughout the show. And even visually, you could show this, right? Like, she is a Hulk, the She-Hulk, and obviously she has to contain her anger. Couldn't there maybe be like a scene where you see her grappling with the very real like sexist environment, either like female lawyers or just women in general have to deal with? This is just a personal preference of mine. When I'm watching something with like political messaging, I prefer show, don't tell. And that's my criticism of Spike Lee's last two films. And that would be my criticism of this She-Hulk scene, because I feel like there's a more subtle way to do it, which can be just as effective. But sometimes when you're having characters have this argument where they're outlining something like this in a very explicit way, personally, I don't like it. It doesn't matter what the political messaging is. I made a whole video the other day about that Joe Biden trailer, and I just said, you know, conservatives don't do subtle. So that's why I dislike this scene. But on second thought, I actually kind of like it because it's annoying all the worst people. And yes, some people do need to hear this, and the people getting mad at it are actually the people who need to hear this. So I have complex feelings. So let me know in the comments, am I wrong? Do you think this scene is like perfectly fine? Do you think this scene is well written? Do you think this is the only way to get this type of message across? Do you think I'm completely wrong that I want to be shown something like this and not like told it directly like she's speaking to me through the screen? Let me know down in the comments. But yeah, it's stuff like this which has set the anti-SJWs off really bad. And honestly, at this point, it just makes me laugh how angry they get about things like this. Like, what do they think a show like She-Hulk, which deals with these issues, was gonna be like? But I want to transition a tiny bit into the CGI. Now, people have been criticising the CGI of She-Hulk since the trailer came out, and in some parts it looks terrible. And people were comparing like Pirates of the Caribbean with Davy Jones from like, was it 2007? And they're like, how has CGI gotten so much worse? And even conservatives have picked up upon it, mainly because the people involved in the show are kind of trying to deflect the criticism of the CGI by saying people are criticising the CGI because of sexism more than anything. Not that it looks terrible, which it objectively does. So Brett Cooper, Fem Shapiro, massively AstroTurf channel, congrats on the 1 million subs, Brett Cooper. Even she was talking about this, so I just want to play a clip of this because the Anti-SJWs apparently care about special effects workers now.
This was at the beginning of the month, and GameSpot tweeted out this video, but they said the director of Marvel's She-Hulk has responded to the internet backlash towards the show's CGI. Strap in, folks. You know, in terms of the CGI being critiqued, I do think that has to do with our culture's belief in their ownership of women's bodies. I think that a lot of the critique comes from feeling like they're able to tear apart the CGI women. There's a lot of talk about her body type, and you know, we based her on a lot of Olympic athletes and not bodybuilders, but I think if we'd gone the other way, we would be facing the same critique. People are less angry about the design, and they are more angry about the execution, because whether she is big or small or what her body type looks like, the CGI just isn't good. You can't pawn that off onto the patriarchy and society's ownership of women. Come on, are we surprised that the director is blaming this on the patriarchy and the ownership of women? I mean, that is just a classic leftist tactic. If there is a problem, it is never their fault. They never, you know, messed up the CGI budget. They never, you know, gave their CGI people enough time to do the animation. No, it's systemic sexism. It's the patriarchy. She also did an interview, to her credit, where she was talking about how the animators were overworked and didn't have enough time. And obviously a lot of that comes down from, you know, studio pressure and like bigger budgets, that kind of thing. But, you know, ma'am, you are the director. You don't get to excuse away the critiques like that. Like, you overworked them. You should have fought for a bigger budget. And if your VFX artists were actually overworked, then stick with that story. Don't change the narrative and try to blame it on society.
So obviously I don't agree with what Brett Cooper, Fem Shapiro is saying there. But what I am a bit mad at is that someone who's supposedly making this like liberal feminist show is given conservative ammo to attack like leftism in general by really not even acknowledging that people don't hate the CGI on She-Hulk because they all hate women. Maybe this is the one time I've ever agreed with like a conservative or anything. By and large, I don't think people hate the design because she's a woman. They hate the CGI because it just looks absolutely terrible. And I'm going to read some more comments by the creators of this show because they actually acknowledge that, yeah, it might not look that great because the VFX artists are being worked pretty hard. So if that's the case, why don't we acknowledge the brutal conditions for workers and the crunch and stuff? Why are we trying to deflect it by pretending people actually don't like the CGI because they don't like women, they don't like She-Hulk's design? Again, I think it's really disingenuous, but we're going to talk about this a bit more because this is a problem that's been going on with Marvel for a long, long time. So Forbes reporting about the backlash. She-Hulk director, writer and star defended her body, sympathizes with Rush VFX artists. So the director of the show, its showrunner and its star have all chimed in about these issues and have made some pretty forceful defenses of the character and those tasked with bringing her to life. Pat Coiro was the person who talked about the quote that Brett Cooper just read out, but then the star of the show, Tatiana Maslany, and the writer showrunner Jessica Gao also talked about the CGI and the VFX artists. So Gao saying, "This is a massive undertaking to have a show where the main character is CG. It's terrible that a lot of artists feel rushed and that they feel that the workload is too massive. I think everybody on this panel stands in solidarity with all workers." Tatiana chimes in, "I feel incredibly deferential to how talented these artists are and how quickly they have to work. Obviously much quicker than probably should be given to them in terms of like churning these things out. We have to be like super conscious of the work conditions, which aren't always optimal. This reflects recent reports about the overall crunch happening to the VFX industry in Hollywood right now, where there's a massive backlog of work, shortage of talent, and Marvel in particular has been brought up as needing tons and tons of support, often on very short notice, often redoing old work, and so on." So I can see people maybe liking their comments in some ways. Like, we stand in solidarity with workers. They churn these things out, and maybe they do them quicker than they should have, right? I appreciate them saying that. So the main actor of She-Hulk, okay, maybe as the actress, she doesn't have much power. But then you have the writers and the creators behind it all talking about the special effects. I don't know. Maybe bring it up with your boss. Maybe bring it up with, how these effects artists are created. I know a lot of them are contractors, so you probably aren't even working that closely with them, especially the writer. But it feels weird. You're working for a company that treats employees so terribly in this industry, and that is the most you can say about it. Like, you can't really do anything else. Like, one person saying people don't like the CGI because they're sexist and stuff, and other people saying, like, yeah, we realise they're exploited and everything like that, and maybe there should be something done about that, but it just feels like they're trying to, like, have their cake and eat it too. Like, here is this show I'm starring in, gonna boost my career and everything like that, and it's basically made by the VFX artist because it relies so heavily on CGI, but I'm not gonna advocate for the workers that make this possible even more. I'm just going to toe the line with Marvel because it's probably the way to get a more lucrative career in Hollywood. But I don't know, it feels pretty gross to try and deflect it onto the women stuff when we know, and it's been widely reported for a long time, that VFX artists are being treated absolutely terrible by Marvel Disney. I don't know if I can play this clip. Originally I found it quite funny, but then I felt quite bad because just like people saying how bad the She-Hulk CGI is, it's not because the people doing the CGI are not talented, it's because they're being massively overworked and crunched by a multi-billion-dollar studio, forcing them to work these long hours because it's so competitive. Just like the gaming industry, there's always going to be someone to replace you because it's a very desirable industry for people who love film and love special effects. So they know that, so they treat you even worse. And there's actually a clip of Taika Waititi and Tessa Thompson, and they're actually analysing a scene from the new Thor movie, and I was so surprised. They were literally talking about how terrible the CGI was, basically.
Okay. Does that look real?
In that particular shot, no, actually. It doesn't really, right? When you look close.
You need to be more blue.
Well,
but does he look real?
No, none of us.
Does she look?
Something looks very off about this. But no, he changes hues, don't you think?
Yeah.
Put in the light. Sometimes he's blue, sometimes he's a little grayish.
But it was really bizarre to me to see the star and the director of this massive movie basically making fun of the CGI, and they must know it's bad. Taika Waititi was probably involved in some way with the CGI, it's his movie, so he probably knows it's bad, and whether or not he has any influence to change it, I don't really know how Marvel works. You think he would, he is a big player in Marvel, making these 4 movies that people like, but again, instead of maybe using his platform to advocate for workers, these millionaires either deflect or they make fun of it because, that's what you do with your own movie. You make fun of the terrible CGI, which was probably made by someone who was massively overworked and rushed, who was in fear of losing their job in this dystopian capitalist hell we call America. So Taika Waititi, people involved on She-Hulk, you all claim to be quite liberal people. You all claim to be quite progressive people. You always talk about the most popular liberal causes of the day. How about some solidarity with your workers? How about advocating for workers' rights? Or do you guys just not care about that because you don't want to kick up a fuss in the world of Hollywood? You're all millionaires. You're all maybe fairly wealthy. What's the point in advocating for overworked VFX artists? They don't matter. They're just going to be in one of like 1,000 people in the credits. No one really cares about them. So not that I need to tell you this anyway, but these people, the VFX artists, are having their labor exploited for profit by a multi-billion-dollar company. Literally the king of entertainment at the moment, the king of comic book movies, and they cannot pay their workers properly. And these films and shows that are grossing so much money, that is from a direct result of their labor. They're not being paid fairly, they're not being treated fairly, and the creative talent involved in this are not advocating for these people enough. They're being exploited for these horrible, profitable movies, and they're just really artistically bankrupt. They're not suffering for art, it's just very clearly they are suffering for profit. And on the VFX subreddit, someone posted, "I'm quite frankly sick and tired of working on Marvel shows. Marvel has probably the worst methodology of production and VFX management out there. They can never fix the look of the show before more than half the allocated time for the show is over. The artists working on Marvel shows are definitely not paid equivalent to the amount of work they put in. obviously, like I was saying, exploiting and profiting off their labor. The charm for working on a Marvel movie is way overrated now, and I would rather be happy working on a TV series after decades and decades of this. Sorry, but had to get off my chest. Yep, I request not to work on them, movies or TV shows. Unfortunately, they're becoming our biggest clients. Marvel VFX, knowing they can exploit the vendors for just one more version and likely inexperienced production people trying to please the big important client, is always a recipe for disaster. Haven't worked on a Marvel project since 2012 and continually asked not to, and I never missed it one bit. On 4, they asked for a complete mini sequence 2 or 3 weeks before deadline. By that I mean from scratch model texture, animated, light and fix that shit in comp. I truly hate this, it annoys me so much. Oh, so you want every department to spend 3 weeks half-arsing it under massive pressure so they have even less time to do it properly? Brilliant plan. Nearly always because they want to screen it to some bigwig who's apparently incapable of understanding the concept of unfinished work and will run crying in terror at a grey model. Agree. After 6 years of working in VFX on non-Marvel shows, I got a taste of one last year. Absolutely the worst show I've ever worked on. I didn't know how much worse it could get until the project came along, and I don't even like Marvel movies, so the shiny factor didn't apply to me. I've worked on quite a few Marvel movies, and I definitely feel this. It's a black hole of sleep deprivation and eating bad, and work from home is terrible because you're on your own. At least when you're in a studio, you're all together getting work done. I switched and now work in VR, and even though it has its own set of challenges, I love it, and bonus, I only work 8 hours a day and have my weekends. Also, another bonus is watching a Marvel movie and not knowing what's going to happen and seeing it as a fan. But as you saw in those testimonies from VFX artists, Marvel movies just seem like insanely unrealistic and poorly put together. And despite having like the biggest franchises on earth, some of the most profitable movies of all time, they still are just crazy and unrealistic when dealing with VFX artists. And I can imagine that creatives are often removed for this. But I do feel like there's some sort of like class disparity between them where, because a lot of these creatives are more wealthy, or the stars of the show who kind of want to talk about this are wealthy, they don't really want to get embroiled in the drama of maybe saying that, yes, Marvel and other studios should treat like smaller VFX firms and VFX workers far better, pay them better. And even that comment about like, it's good because I can work 8 hours a day. How insane is that? It's good because I have my weekends, because it's pretty clear that the standard for these workers is not only working 8 hours a day, is not having your weekends to yourself because you're crunching and working so hard on special effects. So the success of Marvel films, surprising no one, is them exploiting poorer workers who are like invaluable and much needed, and not paying them properly and not treating them properly. And this is what goes into making these massive films that often gross over $1 billion. When a film grosses over $1 billion, are the VFX workers making any more money? So conservatives, you hate Marvel because it's supposedly woke. I hate Marvel because it's both not very good, but also it exists as a result of capitalist exploitation. But like I said, kind of linked to this is how much I really don't rate Marvel films artistically and how I think they are bad for cinema in general, because generally this is how I view Marvel films. Marvel films, like I said before, are meant to be entertaining. They are meant to entertain you for 2 hours, and they're meant to have a factor where you keep coming back for more because they have like multiverses or post-credit sequences, and they're very easy to enjoy. And pretty much all ages can enjoy them, and you understand why kids love them and teenagers and stuff like that. But increasingly, they are becoming homogenized, where they do not have any distinct style. Like I said, there are many films in the MCU that literally could be the same film, because that's what they feel like. Soundtrack and stuff. Do you remember any of the score in the MCU, apart from maybe a theme from Loki or the Avengers theme? I definitely can't. And because these movies are becoming so successful, and because you're reading there, Marvel are becoming like the biggest clients for VFX studios and things like that, it just seems like this beast which is slowly just taking over all of film and all of cinema and just like completely swallowing it up. And I know a lot of Marvel fans get quite sensitive when established directors call out Marvel, but I do tend to agree with directors because at least they've brought something to the medium, they've created good art, and they've actually elevated this whole medium. They haven't just made really throwaway stuff that is maybe fun to watch for 2 hours and you'll never think about it again. So I just want to go into some comments from Mark Ruffalo defending the MCU, and then some directors criticising the MCU before I go into even more of my own criticism. So I don't want to talk about this whole story, but I will say I prefer Star Wars infinitely more than the MCU, because I think the conception of Star Wars was actually trying to say something about politics, as were the prequels, and I think it just makes them inherently better, where the MCU generally does not have any societal message. But Star Wars catches strays, gets dragged by Mark Ruffalo in defense of the MCU. So when asked if there's too much Marvel, Ruffalo says, "It's not something I worry about. I understand that these things run their course and then something else comes along, but the thing Marvel has done well is that inside the MCU, just as they do with comic books, they let a director or actor sort of doing a lot of work here, recreate each piece to their own style, their likeness. Marvel generally lets them bring that to the material." And I'm going to heavily dispute this a bit later and use Chloe Zhao as the example, because I firmly believe that no matter who is directing a Marvel movie, the studio will not let them put their own stamp and style on it. So Marvel generally lets them bring that to the material. If you watch a Star Wars, you're pretty much going to get the same version of Star Wars each time. It might have a little bit of humor, it might have a little bit of different animation, but you're always really in the same kind of world. But with Marvel, you can have a whole different feeling, even within the Marvel universe. So I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I would say generally, I think Star Wars is more different from one another than most MCU films. I would say Rogue One and Episode 9, or Rogue One and Episode 1, or Han Solo and Episode 2 are far more different from each other than Avengers and Spider-Man, or Captain America and, I don't know, Spider-Man or Avengers or Doctor Strange. I think there are more stylistic and, I guess, tonal differences within Star Wars itself. I would just say that because of the more consistent aesthetic of Star Wars, maybe if you're not a fan, you cannot really recognize the differences. But like Rogue One and Revenge of the Sith look a lot different from some of the other Star Wars movies. As a Star Wars fan, as someone who thinks Star Wars has far more redeeming qualities than the MCU, just thought I'd point that out. But one of my absolute favourite things is watching some of my favourite directors criticise the MCU, and I do love this. An article in November just kind of summarising all of these comments. Ridley Scott and the grand tradition of big-name directors disparaging superhero movies. So Ridley Scott said the screenplays are the issue, Scott told Deadline, adding that if you think about it, he sort of made 3 superhero movies himself, Alien, Gladiator and Blade Runner. That's kind of cool. Blade Runner is both one of the best movies of all time and actually the best superhero movie of all time as well. None of which suffered from weak stories or lackluster writing, so what's going on over there with Marvel and DC? Sorry, the House of Gucci director continued. I got off the rail, but I mean, come on. They're mostly saved by special effects, and that's becoming boring for everyone who works with special effects if you've got the money. I mean, even now, they're not really being saved by special effects. Ridley Scott also said, you know, they're fucking boring as well. That's not in this article I'm reading you. So Martin Scorsese, of course, infamously wrote about it in 2019 and saying, many of the elements that define cinema as I know it are there in Marvel pictures. What's not there is revelation, mystery, or genuine emotional danger. Yep, 100% Martin Scorsese. Nothing is at risk. The pictures are made to satisfy a specific set of demands, and they are designed as variations on a finite number of themes. Absolutely correct. I don't know why anyone got mad about this, especially Marvel directors. Nothing is at risk, of course. MCU movies have zero stakes. They don't make you feel anything. There's no tension. There's no stress about it. The fact that most MCU fans say turn your brain off to enjoy these movies, I think says everything. So basically they're boring in concept. Scorsese allows that this could be a matter of taste. I know that if I were younger, if I'd have come of age at a later time, I might have been excited by these pictures and maybe even wanted to make one myself. The issue is how the financial dominance of superhero films might negatively impact the development and very existence of their smaller peers. And Martin Scorsese is a guy who does a lot of work funding films from countries that do not have big film industries. So for him to get criticism from MCU directors is absolutely laughable. Like, what are they doing to preserve the medium, except for selling out for a paycheck. So Francis Ford Coppola echoing the sentiment, saying, when Martin Scorsese says that the Marvel pictures are not cinema, he's right, because we expect to learn something from cinema. We expect to gain something, some enlightenment, some knowledge, some inspiration. I don't know that anyone gets anything out of seeing the same movie over and over again. Martin was kind when he said it's not cinema. He didn't say it's despicable, which I just say it is. Alejandro Gonzalez Inarritu, who made Birdman and The Revenant, also said, sometimes I enjoy them because they're basic and simple and go well with popcorn. The problem is that they sometimes purport to be profound based on Greek mythology kind of thing. I always see them as killing people because they do not believe in what you believe, or they are not being who you want them to be. I hate that, and I don't respond to those characters. He went on, they have been a poison because the audience is so overexposed to plot and explosions that doesn't mean nothing about the experience of being a human being. So of course, I totally agree with all those directors. Like, the only films that could exist would be like Blade Runner, Mean Streets, Birdman, and stuff like that. And I would say that is better than having hundreds of MCU movies. But I honestly, if you're into films, I don't see anything controversial about what those three are saying. And the fact that people criticize them so hard for it is pretty mind-blowing to me. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with liking the MCU. Even Inarritu said he enjoys these movies from time to time. But to act like there's anything creatively interesting or emotional, or these movies say anything about the human experience, politics, society, is absolutely laughable. People will not remember Avengers Age of Ultron in 20 years. People will not remember nearly all these MCU movies because they have nothing to say, and artistically, they are nothing. So personally, I don't like plot in films as much as I like the vibes. My favourite films are both Blade Runners, Spike Jonze's Her, Terrence Malick's The New World, and maybe The Thin Red Line, and maybe far lower, something like Drive. In terms of, like, if you think about all these movies, it's about the vibe, it's about the visual imagery, it's about the score, and it's about the artistic nature of these things in creating these worlds and telling these stories through a visual medium. And that's just me. I like that sort of thing. And even something like Mean Streets, which is a bit more traditional, I really love the vibe of that era of New York and how Scorsese creates it with the soundtrack. No, Mean Street's narrative isn't too complicated, neither is Blade Runner and stuff like that. And what it does for the film medium, it just takes advantage of, you know, all the elements of it, where Marvel is literally just like, here is something entertaining and really basic. Here is some cringeworthy dialogue. And when these films become so encompassing, I feel like it's just really undermining the artistic nature of so many films, and there's a place for everything. So Top Gun Maverick is a good example where the action is pretty mindless and stuff, but the actual craft of making that movie is, you know, amazing compared to an MCU movie. Like, all these actors going around these planes for this film, I respect it so much, even if I don't think it's the best movie ever. But MCU and, you know, to a lesser extent some of the Star Wars series, filming everything on a green screen or in an aircraft hangar with these giant, like, screens that have, like, video game software filling in most stuff, I think it takes away from films so much. And things like Blade Runner or Once Upon a Time in America, using all these extras, using these real sets, it adds so much to the visual experience, to the immersiveness. You feel like you're watching something real. When I watch an MCU movie or anything, I feel like I'm watching a video game. So if anyone likes films at all, you shouldn't be happy about the absolute dominance of things like the MCU on TV and in cinema, because it's just bad for the medium as a whole, because then everyone just wants to have the next MCU. And we saw this, remember, like, that stupid, I forgot what it was even called, it was like Frankenstein's monster, Tom Cruise is in it, it was like going to be this universe thing. They tried to do it with the DCEU as well, quickly create like Avengers in their own universe, and it was ridiculous. But I feel like everyone aspiring to make their own MCU just shows how profit motivated all these studios are, and how willing they are to exploit their workers to try and turn around these movies as quick as possible, like the MCU does, to maintain their dominance on the industry. Now, one more thing I want to end on is that Mark Ruffalo said that basically most directors who make MCU movies can put their own style on them, and that's why the MCU is good. I would heavily dispute this. Taika Waititi to an extent, but I still feel he's confined by the MCU formula, but most other MCU movies they all feel the same, they all look the same. Even stuff like Sam Raimi, who made the latest Doctor Strange, there is some Sam Raimi elements, but does Doctor Strange not feel like an MCU movie that is pretty generic? It still very much does. And I think the best example of this is Chloe Zhao, who directed The Eternals, and she of course directed Nomadland. You know, I have my problems with Nomadland. I respect like the visuals. I still think it's a kind of weird movie for its depiction of Amazon especially. But I didn't know this about Chloe Zhao. I was actually just looking for stuff on Reddit about The New World, which is one of my favourite films. And as luck would have it, one of Chloe Zhao's favourite films, which influenced her work, is The New World. And she actually spoke about this in an interview.
And also the filmmaker's curiosity towards trying to talk about humanity through nature. Because it's not just us and nature, we're the same thing, we're part of the universe. So he's trying to really ask us to think that way in his filmmaking. And that dictates how he worked with his actor and how his cinematography works. I was very fortunate recently to be able to speak to one of the actors in the film, and he said that it was so intense, the reality that Malick has created on set and the production design, and even the set builders was building Jamestown were in period costume. So when they go back to the hotel, that feels like a set.
And if you guys don't know, Terrence Malick's style is very unconventional. And I would say that even I don't really like some of his more modern films because it gets a bit too out there. But I've always said on Twitter, if Terrence Malick or David Lynch made an MCU movie, it would look like an MCU movie. It wouldn't look like a David Lynch, and it wouldn't look like a Terrence Malick movie. And I think Chloe Zhao is good proof in that. And that Nomadland is very, very distinct. She talks about how much she loves Terrence Malick, and then she churns something out like The Eternals. And is anyone going to argue with me that if Chloe Zhao had, or Taika Waititi had free reign on their movies, they would look like the movies that we got? Are you seriously going to believe that? Because that's not how it works. I feel like the MCU gets these, you know, acclaimed directors just to show they get them. I don't think they actually want them. They'd rather have the Russo brothers churn out generic garbage for the rest of time rather than have Chloe Zhao, Taika Waititi. They just do that to kind of show like, oh, we have these nominated directors directing the MCU. Isn't it like high art now? And I really don't like the Russo brothers. I think their films are just terrible. Like, all of them are terrible. And they're coping quite bad. Because imagine if you were a pair of directors who have made some of the highest grossing films of all time, and all your peers, everyone you look up to, hates your work still. And I love this quote by them. So the Russo brothers, they suggested that the movie-going world needs to evolve beyond an old-school reverence to the auteur model of cinema, bringing to mind how directors like Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola have dissed Marvel in recent past. Auteur filmmaking is 50 years old at this point. It was conceived in the 70s. I don't really think that's true. We grew up on that. We were kids. It was really important to us. But we're also aware that the world needs to change. And the more that we try to prevent it from changing, the more chaos we create. It's not anyone's place to reject the next generation's ideas. I find that absolutely fascinating that they think corporate slop and garbage is what we should be embracing. The stuff that they make, every movie they've made outside the MCU is really bad. All the MCU movies are generic as hell. I would take Francis Ford Coppola and Scorsese's worst movie over their best movie because all of their movies are artistically bankrupt. And I think that's hilarious. They're coping so hard with being criticized by like some of the best filmmakers of all time, saying, well, we need to do away with the auteur filmmaker. We're the new generation. All of our films look the same, sound the same, and have nothing to say. That's what we should embrace, everyone. Embrace stuff like Marvel. Embrace the MCU. Embrace Infinite MCU that never ends and looks the same and has nothing to say. Again, these comments are funny because they just seem so bitter. But guys, even if you like the MCU, you don't want this. You don't want a future dominated by the Russo brothers. And I think the problem with a lot of these fans of the MCU in general is they aren't film fans. They are nerd media fans. They are Marvel fans who like the Marvel films as an extension of that. They don't like films first and like Marvel films because they're good films. Because if you are into films, there is no way you think any of the Marvel films are high art. I will give a little shout out to DC. And I know this seems weird because they've made such corporate garbage, like Suicide Squad, the first one, where David Ayer literally said they just ruined his film to make a more marketable product. I will say the Joker and the Batman, and maybe the Joker 2, which is meant to be like a musical, I will say that is a step in the right direction. And even films like The Dark Knight, when you can visibly see the influence of like other filmmakers in the work of a superhero movie, I think that's generally a positive sign, because it shows the directors of those movies actually revere cinema and revere film. And maybe they don't do it in a great way. So The Joker, for example, is a mashup of The King of Comedy and Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese, but also You Were Never Really Here, which also starred Joaquin Phoenix. The Batman is clearly influenced by David Fincher, mainly Seven in my opinion, and I like that. Even though I think these films might be a bit too derivative, I like that because it shows the directors are trying to make a good film. They're not trying to make a capitalist product. They're not trying to make just a franchise for the sake of it. They're trying to make something that is maybe art. I think that's actually why Joker had such a positive reaction, because a lot of these people who watch the Joker have never seen Scorsese, have never seen You Were Never Really Here. They see the Joker, which is, you know, trying to be like those movies, and like, oh, I actually like good movies all of a sudden. And even with the Batman, I think the visual style was so good. I think that's the best thing about that movie. It has such a great vibe, has such a great visual style, is so distinct. Gotham is such a great setting in that movie especially, and that gives me a bit of hope. I wish Marvel would have ended the MCU with the Avengers, and I wish they would copy some of the stuff DC is doing right now. I'm not being a DC fanboy, but even Nolan's stuff, The Dark Knight, is obviously influenced by Michael Mann and Heat. I just feel like getting in directors who love film and letting them make something that is more true to cinema and themselves is so much better than hiring people like Chloe Zhao, who are inspired by great filmmakers, who are great filmmakers in their own right, and then pay them to make a very, very generic film. I'm sure Chloe Zhao likes that paycheck and probably liked working on the Eternals. You can't convince me that is the movie she would have made if she could have made anything. So kind of blending two videos into one. I don't know how long this video is going to be, but I finally had to try and cancel the MCU. I hope you guys see my point of view, even if you don't agree with it. You can like the MCU, that's fine. I have no problem with that. But I'm trying to show you guys, if you like film, the MCU is just not good for film as a whole. And I'm actually scared it's going to be completely saturated. And I hope there's going to be an MCU crash. And I do kind of enjoy seeing critics really not liking the recent ones, because I'm starting to feel like maybe they're going to have to do what DC did. Maybe they're going to have to go back to formula. Maybe they're going to have to let people who actually like movies direct these movies and give them a bit of free reign so they can make something more distinct and unique, rather than something that looks like Captain America Civil War. Anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.